the London Bridge Sports Medicine Podcast.
Medical news, health, fitness.
With Dr. Ajai Seth.
Hi there. Welcome to LBSM's Ask the Expert series. We put the important questions to our experts to give you the latest tips in health and fitness. Today we talk to Robbie, who is a dietitian and nutrition expert for endurance runners. We talk about how to fuel for endurance events and what the best ways are to make sure you optimize your performance. If you feel you need further information about any of the issues we discussed today, please feel free to get in touch. Hope you enjoy listening. So, hi, welcome to Ask the Expert, and today we have got our dietitian, sports dietitian, Robbie Green. Robbie, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Dr. Ajay. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Absolute pleasure to have you. And today we're going to be talking all things endurance related, particularly around endurance sports and fueling, which is a key area of interest of yours, Robbie, isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I work I'm a clinical dietitian by background, but also have a specialist interest in sports nutrition. And that largely stems from my interest in endurance sports, where I guess I would say I started out as a runner, and I've over the years merged over to cycling, but still have a strong interest in all areas. And I guess a lot of the clients that I see tend to be, from a sports nutrition aspect, tend to be endurance athletes and people looking to, I guess, take on these challenges which endurance sport throws at you.
And to some people, they seem absolutely bonkers, don't they, in terms of what they're trying to achieve and what they're trying to do, put their bodies through. So I guess the first question I think a lot of people aren't really clear on is what is an endurance event? What classifies as an endurance event?
Yeah, a good question. And I think just to cap on what you just said, some of those events are bonkers, aren't they, when you look at them? But I guess it's a sporting event, which is where we're sustaining submaximal effort for prolonged periods. So I guess the classic sports that we look at with endurance sport are swimming, running, cycling. And we're looking at distances and durations that are going beyond, like an hour at a time. There are events out there where, people are undertaking 24-hour events. It could be, Ironman events where you're touching all three different exercises there. So cycling, swimming, and running. A lot of it comes down to, it's defined by kind of oxygen consumption and aerobic fitness. And I guess, one of the primary sort of limiting factors in endurance sport is fatigue. So whilst a lot of it comes down to our training and fitness, it's about sort of training the body to go for these prolonged durations and fighting fatigue.
Okay, so that's interesting. So actually most people's conception of endurance will be exactly like you said, like a certain distance. So marathon distance, maybe endurance, but actually it's more to do with the metabolic demands that the event is placing on the body that makes it endurance.
Yeah, I would say so. And I might be corrected. Some of the literature may define it differently, but we have endurance sports and events now which I guess go under those sort of marathon distance. You have Olympic distances where, I think it's, you're looking at 20K and 10K distances. But it largely comes down to those physiological and metabolic demands that we're sustaining for prolonged periods.
Okay.
And I guess one of the defining things for me with endurance sport is that it takes planning and it takes determination and a lot of strategy, because it's, these events are things that majority of people won't be able to just kind of put the running shoes on and undertake. You have to really kind of train your body and kind of push those thresholds, those fitness thresholds, those aerobic thresholds to be able to, sustain these distances, which are really kind of putting your body through not just a physiological battle, but a psychological one as well.
And that kind of adaptation takes time. It's not the kind of thing you could rock up and get done in a week, I would imagine.
Absolutely. And, I think a lot of people at first will be put off by endurance events and the prospect of going and running for 26 miles, but it's It does. It just takes that gradual sort of building on yesterday's performance and last week's performance, and it really just a lot of it comes down to exposure to these new distances and new feelings and new pain thresholds. But ultimately, there's a lot of reward at the end of it. We're painting quite a grim picture there, but there is I would say it's definitely a growing area of sport and interest for a lot of people, isn't it?
Yeah, and some of the people I speak to who do it say it's almost like a transcendence type thing. That they are typically they spend a lot of time on their own training, and they get to understand their bodies on a whole nother level, as well as their mind. So there's definitely a lot of benefits for endurance sport. Robbie, you mentioned the metabolic element of it. So what would be, when it comes to metabolic demands on the body with endurance sport, what just in a very basic sort of level, how does that differ from your normal jog around the park, for example?
It's a really good question, and I think a good way to split this is to quickly, and I'll really quickly try and simplistically touch on the different energy systems we have. So we have anaerobic energy production, which is where we're producing energy without oxygen, and we do that for energy for exercise that requires like a really quick burst of energy, such as sprinting, lifting weights. And we can only sustain anaerobic exercise for very short periods, like we're talking seconds and less than minutes. Yeah. We then have our aerobic system, which is producing energy with oxygen. And we can do this for much longer periods. So there are two different forms there as well. There is one, which is the glycolytic pathway, which we're using carbohydrate and oxygen to produce energy. Now we can do that for about 2 to 3 hours because we store glucose and carbohydrate or glycogen in our muscles and our liver, but that will run out after probably 2 to 3 hours if we don't top that up. We then have the other side of aerobic fitness and aerobic energy production is where we use our fat stores. So we don't produce energy as quickly using this pathway, so we can't kind of sustain the same level. So I guess if you were walking and doing something very light, moderate, you can you've got energy supplies there for a long time, because think about how much fat we store around our body. There's up to say 50,000-60,000 calories in the average person there. So endurance sport, I guess when you're talking about the metabolic demands, it's basically this type of sport which severely taxes those carbohydrate stores. So unlike, these fat reserves, that can be really kind of limiting to your performance and I guess how long you can go for. So it's about, one of the big things is training the body to become a more efficient fat burner, because you've got those two systems and they kind of can work harmoniously, but it's trying to make the body less reliant on the carbohydrate stores and I guess slightly better at producing energy from those fat stores which we have in such large volumes throughout the body.
Because most carbohydrate stores, as you say, will only last 2-3 hours, and most endurance events last longer than 2-3 hours. So ultimately, unless you are really, really topping up those sugar levels and those carbohydrate stores as you go along, which isn't always possible, it's very difficult to do, you will ultimately end up going to fat burning mode. And you mentioned the anaerobic system, so things like sprinters, and that's a very different type of training, isn't it? And a type of fuel economy, really.
Absolutely, yeah. And the thing about anaerobic systems is it's like you say, it can be, sprinting is a prime example where we need to produce energy extremely quickly to meet a very acute demand. But anaerobic and aerobic exercise can work at the same time. The exercises such as interval training, tennis is a really good example where you're sprinting, stopping. But the issue with anaerobic exercise is we produce large volumes of lactic acid. So people have probably experienced it where you get that, you sprint a certain distance and then your legs start feeling heavy and they burn and you have to stop. So that type of energy production is something that we're not going to be tapping into realistically in endurance sport because you'll know about it quite quickly.
So Robbie, you mentioned thresholds. What do you mean by that? Is that the border between aerobic and anaerobic?
I guess you've got the border between anaerobic and aerobic, but in endurance sport, the more important one is probably that threshold between those two different systems of the one where you're predominantly burning your glycogen stores, so your carbohydrate stores, and the one where you're burning your fat stores.
Okay.
So like as you mentioned, we have a very limited supply of carbohydrate, and what we don't want is for that to run out. It's a term that people have potentially heard of called they call it bonking, and it's basically hitting the wall. It's something that I actually personally I thought I'd experienced before, and I regularly used to think, I've experienced hitting the wall. But it was a few months back. I went out cycling. I was doing about 40 miles and hadn't had breakfast, and it's I would describe it as the feelings associated to kind of hypoglycemia. You know, you suddenly become drained of all sort of carbohydrate stores, and your body switches to that fat burning mode. And I guess that fat burning mode isn't sufficient to supply you with the energy you need to be exercising at that level. So, yes, we have that battle, as you just mentioned, of keeping those stores topped up. But that is very challenging when you're also exerting so much energy in the event that you're doing.
So the key is to stay around the threshold or slightly below it.
I guess it's a bit of both, really. I guess it depends what you're doing. I guess during the event, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit later. So during your event, you kind of want to find that happy medium and know your body well, that you stay below the threshold and know when you're going to run out. I guess with endurance sport, with the volume of training that you do start understanding your body, and you kind of start knowing how long a certain volume of fuel or food, we'll just say, you know, like food and drink, will last you. I guess during training, that's where you kind of push the boundaries a bit, and you try and get closer to the threshold, and just, you know, you risk sort of hitting the wall. Yeah. But yes, a lot of it comes down to training the body and increasing those thresholds and achieving adaptations that are ultimately going to make us fitter aerobically and, you know, more efficient in terms of our fuel systems, the ones we've just been discussing.
And that brings us nicely on to food and nutrition. So I guess there's two elements here. One is the training element. What kinds of things are we trying to achieve when we're training? And secondly, on the performance day, on race day, what are the strategies we can implement to try and get through the endurance event best? And I imagine exercising within certain fat to adapt to using fat is going to be key for training.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some very well researched and well written about strategies there. But I guess ultimately the approach here is that we want to optimize our carbohydrate availability so that we're not running out during the events themselves. Okay. And I guess nutrition is a huge part of this, and it's not just about like our intakes during the event or before the event. It also comes down to recovery and I guess the types of training as well. So one of the common things, one of the strategies that's kind of really well researched these days, I don't know if you've heard of this, is training low and competing high. Yeah. And it's where we expose our bodies to, so I guess to go back a couple of steps, during the event, the priority is that we have as much carbohydrate as available as possible. So
that's the goal, isn't it?
That's the goal. Yeah. You want to think about, so before I touched on it, I mentioned, roughly the muscles and the liver have, say, 2,000 calories, or we can store 2,000 calories of glycogen there. So on event day, we want to make sure that we've got close to 2,000. Now, if we train in that state every day, we're not exposing our body to these experiences of being in low carbohydrate states where we then switch to fat burning. So there are ways in which we can tweak the training, and it's called train low, compete high. So what it means is sort of switching and exposing ourselves to low carbohydrate states. And there's various ways in which you can do that. It could be that we simply, during these training periods, we eat a lower carbohydrate diet. It could be, some people will train twice, and with their second training session, they'll have inadequately or just consumed like a high protein or a high fat meal without carbohydrate. It could be that we do fasted running. Lots of different ways we can do it. And whoever's listening, probably you are right. A lot of them are quite unpleasant and often result in, I guess, compromised performance or just kind of feeling generally unwell. So again, it comes, one thing I often say as well to my clients is, don't push yourself into kind of making yourself feel unwell when you're training. You have to find that happy medium and make sure that, you're still getting benefits from the training you're doing.
And for example, training fasted, you've mentioned. So I think a lot of people are clocking onto that now with different variations in food patterning and dieting anyway. We hear about things like 18-6 and that kind of stuff. So if someone is training in the morning fasted, is that something that is potentially helpful for them when it comes to competing in endurance event because they are training in a fasted state, or does it depend on how much they are doing that form of training?
It's a really good question, and if I listen to tons of podcasts, read lots of research, and people often sit at very opposite ends, or they sit in the middle. There's lots of kind of varied views, which is the way with nutrition research. So, I mean, the beauty of it is that you're exposing yourself to those low carbohydrate states from the off. So you're basically forcing your body to fuel that exercise by burning fat, because the glycogen stores will be so low, they'll probably run out quite quickly. The compromise is that your performance is probably going to be less than what you'd be able to perform when you're in a high carbohydrate state. So if every day you trained in a fasted state, you're probably not going to make the progress that you would make if you're in a high carbohydrate state. You're not going to be able to run I'm talking about running here, but I guess the same goes for all exercises. So you wouldn't be able to run as fast, probably wouldn't be able to run for as long. So I guess when we link that back to endurance sport, you're not exposing yourself to those new paces and those new distances. However, you are exposing your body to these new physiological ways of producing energy. So go into the research. The research is actually really, really interesting because it shows that physiologically these adaptations do occur. So this is why a lot of athletes do still do this and undertake this type of training and mix it up. And mixing it up is the key here. But when we look at the actual kind of performance-related outcomes, it's very limited. There's very few studies that kind of show us clearly that these fasted training states actually result in improved performance outcomes. And I guess one of the things there is that it's quite difficult to assess performance of, most athletes, if they're performing in an event, don't want to do it in a low carbohydrate state. So we're sort of limited by the volume of research in that area.
But you did mention variety there, didn't you? So actually, it's I guess with anything in life, too much of one thing is potentially bad for you. So if you were training all the time in a fasted state, and you were doing a keto diet, and that's what your training was revolved around, and your daily intake of carbohydrate was very, very low, you may not be getting the same benefits as someone who was varying up their training and trained in a high carbohydrate state. So I think is the message: try to mix up as much as possible.
Absolutely. I think the most important thing is trying different types of training. And this is completely observational because it's from my own perspective. And I guess some of the people that I train with, I've noticed the biggest differences to my own performance when I started mixing up, doing some fasted runs, doing some, prolonged runs. I guess when I first started running, I probably just run at the same pace for the same distance every single time I went, and very little changed.
Well, people are habitual, aren't they? So they will have their egg and their cup of tea before they go for their morning run, and that's their routine. So it's about incorporating variety into your training plan, just as you would do for the training element side of it, but the nutrition, the diet side of it, I would imagine.
Exactly. They're all very much interlinked. And I guess, nutrition is important to any sport, but I guess with endurance, it is it's such a key element of it. Without properly planned nutritional strategies and so many things come into this, because today we're focusing so heavily on energy, but you also have to find that plan that doesn't leave you feeling too heavy, that doesn't leave you feeling with gut issues, which are so common in endurance sports. So it's about, as you mentioned there, mixing it up, finding a variation that works for you. You might find that all of a sudden you start making more gains and more progress with this new approach, and just keep adapting. But use that training time between events to really find what works for you. And I guess don't play about with it too much near the event itself.
Right. So that brings us again on nicely to the event, race day. So do I need to eat 3 bowls of pasta the night before the race?
It's an interesting one, and I think you're probably referring to a lot of the claims of carb loading and piling the carbs in. It is to a certain extent we do need to, we want to top up those glycogen stores, as we mentioned, and we need the carbohydrate to come in. But it massively comes down to what works for you and what's right. So carb loading, just for those who are listening, it's a strategy where you, I guess, improve your performance and the availability of carbohydrate on race day. And years and years ago, from research, the recommendations were that you depleted your glycogen stores first, so basically run them dry, and then in the few days building up to the event, where we're scaling back training and tapering, we then start heavily loading carbohydrates into, I guess, what the claim was, that we could optimize them by an additional 10-20%. I think that's what they thought, but that claim has since been kind of debunked, and the recommendations now with carbohydrate loading and just optimizing those stores is to continue to scale back training and taper in the build up to an event, and then we adapt to a much higher carbohydrate intake. Now, recommendations vary depending on the event, and it's the literature says kind of 5 grams to 12 grams per kilo of body weight, again depending on the individual. So for those who aren't aware of how much that consists of, 12 grams per kilo is probably, you're talking like Tour de France athlete level, and that is those are serious volumes of carbohydrate. We're talking it would be a kilo of pasta probably.
Wow.
So you have to start adapting to things like liquid nutrition and whatnot. But ultimately it comes down to the individual and the context, and does your gut tolerate these levels? Does it work for you? How do you feel on race day and those sorts of things?
Well, and you mentioned it earlier, actually, in consuming a large amount of any food source, if you're not used to it, haven't done it before, can actually cause issues with the gut itself. And for example, the three bowl pasta analogy, if I ate 3 bowls of pasta, I would have gas that would be escaping for the next week and a half. So I think everyone's different, and everyone, it's about not trying new things the day before the race. I think that's the other key message here.
Absolutely. It's finding what works for you. And, gut symptoms are so common. And there are little tweaks that kind of everyone can make. I guess thinking about pre-race nutrition, and particularly like those build-up days, I would think of it more of a temporary diet. So, we probably move away from the classic quarter plate being protein, quarter plate being, non-starchy, starchy carbohydrates, and then vegetables, and thinking about it, the focus being about carbohydrates. And then if we start considering, well, what's going to be most easily digested, what's going to be least impactful in terms of gut symptoms. So we probably health recommendations that we choose kind of complex carbohydrates and whole grains. However, they can be problematic in the build up to an event, so it's actually sometimes an idea to switch to your refined and processed carbohydrates, the ones that are just quickly digested, quickly absorbed. Just because the priorities shifts from achieving optimal health to just simply thinking, for the next 3 days, it's about getting those fuel stores to where I want them to be for that event.
Brilliant. Okay, so race morning, most of these events, for some reason, have to start at 5 in the morning. I don't know, they can't take a a peaceful time and start midday. So they start very, very early. So most people won't be eating a fry up at 4 in the morning to accommodate that. So they might go into the race in a semi-fasted state. Or they might try and get some, like we said, some carbohydrate sources in the morning. What would be your main top tips or strategies for race day fueling?
This is an interesting one, and I've got a recommendation here, or a personal habit of mine, which you're probably going to question me on. But I guess let's touch on the literature. So I've got a really good graph in front of me here, actually, which I'm looking at. It comes from and I recommend anyone looking into a guy called Duke and Drup, who does some great research, and it just highlights that there's we have these windows before an event, where the recommendation is that 4 hours before an event, if possible, we consume up to 4 grams per kilo, 3 hours 3 grams, 2 hours 2 grams, 1 hour 1 gram. But this completely comes down to the individual, and I think on the day of the event, that morning breakfast is so individualized. So I would have, I guess when I first started running, I would have kind of something with a protein source, a fat source. I'd probably use milk with my porridge, and I just always found that I was regularly feeling really heavy, kind of struggled and a bit zapped during the event.
Yeah.
And the one thing I've switched to is just focusing purely on carbohydrate. It's not about eating a healthy breakfast. It's just about fueling. So I myself actually wake up on an event day, would wake up 4 hours before an event and just drink ground oats with water.
Oh,
so,
lovely.
But it doesn't sound great, but it's a means to an end.
Yeah.
And it's that, I guess for me, my issue was that I was feeling heavy before the event. Some people I know plenty of athletes who will consume quite a heavy breakfast 2 hours before and feel fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the important thing is getting a big volume of carbohydrate in when you can. Find the window that works for you. Hydration is also massive and often forgotten, because it can be a bit more challenging drinking fluids first thing in the morning. But I often recommend having, not just fueling on or hydrating on water, maybe having an isotonic drink. So, you're adding some carbohydrates in there.
Yeah.
And then potentially, 1 hours before the race or whatever it is, the event is that you're doing, consuming another kind of carbohydrate source there. Personally, I just think on that morning, prioritize carbohydrates, whether it's, like bananas, toast, oats.
Yeah. Okay. And what about, so during the event, so you're running or you're doing whatever you can, I guess, well, actually that's an important point, because the food sources available to you will kind of depend on the activity you're doing to some degree, and whether you can stop and all the rest of it. But what would you say, say you're doing a multiple hour event, how would you sort of time your food intake and your drink intake?
Yeah, really good one as well, Les. And I think the important thing here is really practicing this in the build-up. So we touched on quite a lot at the beginning about we want to avoid those glycogen stores completely running out. That's the point where we hit the wall. And when we hit that wall, it's not a case of we can just put carbohydrates in and we'll be good to go again. It's kind of once you hit that wall, the damage is done. So the goal in terms of nutrition during the event is not to top it up once it runs out. It's to keep a kind of regular supply going in, so that the rate in which you're using those carbohydrate stores is slowed down. We kind of really reduce the way in which we're utilizing them. And we do that by having a regular source of carbohydrate going through the bloodstream as well. And it will just mean that instead of really kind of primarily pulling glycogen stores and using them, we'll have a trickle of carbohydrate going for the blood, and we'll only need to kind of rely on them in a much smaller way. So the important thing is to fuel from the off with carbohydrate, depending on the event. I guess the literature suggests that below 90 minutes, we don't need additional carbohydrates. It might be that we just hydrate.
Yeah.
Beyond that, there's a variation in terms of grams of carbohydrate to be taking per hour. I think it goes up to about 60 grams per hour, which is the equivalent of a couple of gels. But again, it ultimately comes down to what event you're doing, how long, and what you can tolerate. Some people don't tolerate gels. Some people are great on the bike and they can actually eat, good solid foods.
And so once you bonk, it's hard to come back, is basically what we're saying.
Yeah, you really, really want to avoid hitting that wall. It's like I say, I relate to that time when I, hit the wall myself when I was on the bike, and I pulled over, I had actually taken an energy bar with me, but even after consuming that and having 10 minutes, it was still that, the feeling of energy that was left in my legs was kind of gone at that point. So it's important now, it's very easily done as well, because the problem is when you're running and the blood flow is going to all of your muscles and not to your gut. We have a gut-brain axis. It kind of cuts off those feelings of appetite and wanting to eat. So it's actually training myself to think it's not that I want to eat, but I know that I physically need fuel from this food. So it's a really important part of training, just exposing yourself to intake during exercise, which is ultimately not that pleasant.
And some people live and die by sachets. Some people live and die by bananas or raisins or nuts. But I guess it doesn't matter, does it? It's just the top up, which is key.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it does to a certain extent. And depending on if you tolerate most foods well, I would probably choose the most energy dense. If you find that you have gut systems, then we do probably need to start looking at the types of carbohydrate that you're consuming. Again, there are different thresholds, and I guess it's the way in which those carbohydrates are transported, and it can really cause major issues in the gut. And this is one of the most limiting factors in endurance sport for a lot of people. And Dr. Adrian, I'm sure you've seen a lot of people in clinic with gut symptoms. It's a really challenging thing to overcome, but the gut can be trained in terms of what we expose it to.
The gut has a brain and it can be trained, as we say.
Absolutely.
All right, and you mentioned another thing that actually I just want to touch on before we close up is hydration. So one of the medical no-nos when we're covering endurance events is low sugar levels, as you might expect, but also people taking on too much fluid. So they're drinking too much water, and actually what they're doing by taking on all that water is changing the salts within their body and essentially diluting them, which can actually be quite dangerous. So again, most people when they're training, they don't take on, they don't really think about having much water. But as soon as it's race day, everyone gets obsessed with hydration, and water bottles flying everywhere. There's easy access to water usually. So unless you're doing one of these crazy desert runs, but what would you say the key tips are on hydrating throughout the event, an endurance event?
I think it comes back down to that regular intake and just being consistent and kind of listening to your body. There is literature out there to suggest kind of the volume of fluid we should be taking, the percentage body weight loss that we should ultimately allow our bodies to happen during an event. We say like kind of 1 to 2%. But I think the important thing is just, so in terms of hydration, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but the biggest telltale sign is kind of the color of your urine, and people often don't realize that we can monitor our hydration status by color of our urine, and there's really useful charts online. But I think in terms of during the race,
just on that, champagne colored urine is what we're going for, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah, it's the golden ticket, quite literally. But yeah, I think, and you're really right in what you say. I think a lot of people just, when they train, I mean, I used to do it back in the day. I would go out and do kind of a half marathon or a 15-mile run without any water, and then on actual race day, I'm kind of chugging water and isotonic drinks every 15 minutes. So,
and then you need a wee every half an hour.
Exactly. So you train the way in which you're going to kind of partake on the day, but big tip is that, and people often forget this, is that hydration is just as limiting as losing is kind of zapping out on energy. So you can ultimately improve your performance by probably a few percentage by just maintaining like really adequate levels of hydration.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Robbie. So I guess if we're going to summarize, our top tips would be: 1, have a plan of some description. Training and nutrition, and understand what your plan is involving and who you're developing that plan with. Number 2 would be, I guess, train as you're going to compete on race day. So you want to keep them as similar as possible. And
I guess with that one, I would say vary your training, but at the back of your mind, always have your race day plan. So I guess trial and error, lots of different things, but always know in your head, this is what I'm going to do on the 2 days before, this is what I'm going to do on the night before, this is what I'm going to do the morning of, and this is what I'm going to do during the race. And it's fine to kind of toy around with those things during, like you might say, I'm going to try that porridge and water breakfast that Robbie suggested, or I'm going to try having, 2 bowls of pasta the night before or risotto. But just make sure that whatever you do, it's something that you've done before and you felt pretty good during the event and during the training sessions.
Yeah. And I guess the last one is always, if you're not sure, ask for help. There's lots of advice out there, lots of online resources, I would imagine.
There's tons of online stuff and lots of resources, but I guess, and this is where I often kind of encourage great caution, because much of this, as I mentioned, is observational. It's based on, we have the literature, but even, the top sports nutritionists and the top kind of people in these fields will always say that this is what we've seen across large cohorts. It doesn't say that this will work for you individually. So if you are really struggling, if something's, you just can't find the happy medium for you, that's when, the professionals will kind of support you on this, because it is complex. There are various different systems and so many factors that impact performance in the day and whatnot. So it can be difficult getting to the root cause of issues or barriers.
When you booked in for your next ultra marathon, then, Robbie?
I'm not. So my next one is actually it's a cycling event. So I've got a 100-miler in the lakes later on this year. So
yeah, it sounds lovely.
So there'll be some carb loading before that.
Well, we all know your master plan now. So well, the secret's out of the bag. Thank you. Well, Robbie, thank you so much. That's been really insightful. We could go on talking for hours about this, and I think it'll be definitely great to have you back and just explore different elements of endurance running, or endurance any event really in particular, and how we can optimize that from our diet and our training.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's such an interesting topic, and as you mentioned, we could talk for hours, and the research kind of keeps coming out, and different observations are seen. So I'd love to come back one day. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, and speak soon.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to LBSM's Ask the Expert series. We really hope you enjoyed listening. If any of the topics discussed are relevant to you, or you want to find out more, please get in touch by phone, email, social media, or visit our website. Thanks again, and see you soon.